There's a particular kind of quiet that claims the New Mexico desert when late spring arrives. Not the peaceful sort. This quiet presses down on you. It watches you back. The road cutting across the Jornada del Muerto, call it the Dead Man's Walk if you prefer plain English over Spanish, was never a road that kept its end of the bargain. Late spring, 1883. A stagecoach pushed southward across that basin in New Mexico territory, dragging a white ribbon of alkali dust in its wake. By mid-morning, the heat had already turned vicious, warping the air above the flats into shimmering waves. Mesquite and creosote hugged the cracked earth on both sides of the trail, and beyond them stretched nothing. Mile after mile of bleached rock, a pair of hawks circling the thermals, and the relentless grinding of iron wheel rims chewing through dirt so parched it rose like powder. 5 passengers rode that coach, a heavy-set cattle buyer out of Socorro who slept with his hat pulled over his face, a Methodist preacher with red raw eyes who gripped his Bible the way a drowning man grips a rope, a drummer hauling patent medicines in a brass-buckled case, and pressed against the right-hand door with her small bag in her lap, a young woman named Della Mercer. Della was 24 years old, and she was afraid in the way of someone who has quietly decided that showing it wasn't an option. She wore a dress the color of desert sage and a small hat pinned at a precise angle. Her brown hair was swept up, the way you'd arrange it for something important. Which was fitting, because something important was exactly where she was headed. Her intended was a schoolteacher named Thomas Hadley, waiting in Tularosa. They'd exchanged letters for 9 months. She knew the particular slope of his handwriting better than she knew the sound of his voice. She was traveling over 130 miles alone to marry a man she'd met exactly twice, because in 1883 on the frontier, that wasn't desperation. That was simply how hope did its math. What frightened her wasn't Thomas. It wasn't the wedding. It was this road. The Jornada had swallowed travelers before and asked no questions afterward. It was a stretch of country that civilization had claimed on paper, but not yet earned in practice. It belonged to the hawks, the rattlesnakes, and whoever was bold enough, or desperate enough to work its edges. Della kept her gaze moving to the small, dusty window, and told herself she was fine. The 5th passenger climbed aboard at the way station at the basin's northern end. He said almost nothing. He handed the driver his fare, exact coins, no fumbling, took the left-hand bench across from Della, settled his worn hat low, and folded his arms. Not the folding of a man settling in for sleep. The folding of a man who has decided he doesn't want company. He was lean and sun-weathered, somewhere around 40, with a jaw that looked cut from stone rather than shaped by living, and a coat that had weathered better decades. One boot had been resoled at least twice. The dust in the creases of his hands wasn't sitting on the surface. It had worked itself into the grain, the way dust gets into rock. When the preacher asked his name, he said Roan. Just Roan. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't appear to notice that the drummer found this deeply unsatisfying. Della noticed something else. When the coach stopped at midday to rest the team, every other passenger climbed out to stretch their legs. Roan stayed seated. He wasn't sleeping. Beneath that hat brim, his eyes were moving, tracking the driver on the box, the station hand checking wheel hubs, the tree line a quarter mile to the west. He shifted once, just enough that the left side of his coat fell open a fraction of an inch. Della had grown up around men who carried guns. She understood what that small movement meant. She decided not to stare. The man who'd set all of this in motion wasn't on that coach. He was already out there waiting. Cyrus Vane had worked the Tularosa Basin and the Jornada for going on 6 years, and he'd become the kind of problem that entire counties discussed in careful, lowered voices. He wasn't a simple road agent. Road agents robbed you and moved on. Vane thought in terms of territory. He kept the local law uncertain through a combination of money and the unspoken understanding of what had happened to men who'd pushed back. He was broad-shouldered and handsome in the way of a man who's always known it, with the habit of smiling at people slowly, like he was giving them time to arrive at the conclusion he'd already reached. He had 2 brothers working the Jornada that spring. Dell, the older one, ran cold rather than hot. He was the type who would cut your fence and then sit on the other side of it smoking a cigarette while he waited for you to notice. Patient, deliberate, calculating, cutter. The younger was his opposite, Loud, easily provoked, quick to a weapon. The sort of man that even other outlaws found exhausting to be around. Together, they balanced each other out in precisely the worst way. The information about Della Mercer had come from a man named Elias Scobell, who operated the way station at the basin's north end. Scobell had been on Vane's informal payroll for 3 years. Nothing dramatic, a few dollars here and there in exchange for coach schedules and passenger lists. He was the quiet kind of corruption that never thinks of itself as corruption, just getting by. When the southbound coach rolled through carrying a young woman traveling alone to a wedding, Scobell dispatched a rider to Vane's camp with the details before the dust had even settled. Vane heard about her and did what he always did. Smiled slowly. Made a decision. He didn't want ransom. By outlaw standards, he had enough money. What Cyrus Vane wanted, out in that empty basin where no one contradicted him, was someone who wanted to be there. He decided, without consultation, that person would be Della Mercer. He told Dell and Cutter to take the coach. The ambush came late afternoon, when the basin light turned horizontal and orange and shadows stretched long and strange across the flats. 3 riders came up out of a dry wash to the east with no ceremony, no warning shot, no pause at a respectful distance. Just sudden hoofbeats and drawn weapons. The driver hauled back hard. The team screamed against their bits. Inside the coach, the cattle buyer jolted awake with a shout. The preacher went the color of old bone. Della grabbed the window frame with both hands. The drummer made the mistake of reaching toward his belt. Dell's rifle put a hole through the coach door an inch from his elbow. After that, the drummer held very still. Cutter yanked the door open. His eyes swept the compartment and stopped immediately on Della. That told you everything about Cutter. Roan hadn't moved. Still seated, arms still folded, hat still low. He regarded Cutter with the mild attention of a man watching an insect land on a table. Cutter leveled a pistol at him. You... out. All right, Roan said, flat, unhurried. He stepped down from the coach without glancing at the gun barrel. Now pay attention, friend, because this is the hinge the whole story turns on. Every man on that road, if they'd known who Roan was, would have understood that the sensible thing, the only safe thing, was to shoot him where he stood. But they didn't know. What they saw was a dusty nobody in worn-out boots who carried himself like a man who'd stopped fighting some years back. Roan watched them reach that conclusion, and he let them keep it. He handed over a worn leather wallet when Cutter asked. He kept his eyes on the ground. Dell rode over, looked at Della, and told the driver to unhitch one of the wheel horses. They lifted her onto it. The other passengers were set walking back toward the way station. Roan went with them, slowly at the rear of the group, until the riders stopped watching. He didn't pick up his pace after that. He just started reading the country. The camp was tucked inside a box canyon roughly 8 miles east of the stage road, hidden behind a fold of red rock that made it invisible from the flats. Vane had used it for years. A rope arrangement crossed the narrow cut at the canyon's mouth. Not a bridge, but a series of lines rigged to signal if they were disturbed. A picket line holding 6 horses ran along the eastern wall. 3 more men besides the brothers were in camp. 9 total by the time the riding party brought Della in at dusk. Roan entered that canyon 2 hours after dark. Nobody saw him come in. He found a position in the shadow of the north wall behind a pile of dead fallen rock, settled himself, and spent the next hour simply listening. He catalogued where each man slept, where the fire was burning, where they'd placed Della, a bedroll near the south wall, with one of Vane's men posted 8 feet away. He listened to Cutter complaining about something, and Dell telling him to be quiet. He listened to Vane himself speaking to Della in the soft, measured tone of a man who has mistaken his own calmness for wisdom, telling her she'd come to understand things. Given enough time, Della said nothing in return. Roan heard that silence from the dark and recognized it as courage. He found the picket line before anything else. The horses were always the priority. Had been since the road. You might wonder, friend, why Roan hadn't drawn his weapon at the ambush. Why he'd let himself be walked into a bandit camp like cargo delivered under guard. The answer is straightforward arithmetic. 3 riders. Poor light. 2 more men still out of sight. Bad ground. A road is the worst possible place for this kind of work. Everything is moving. Nothing is predictable. A camp is different. In a camp, you know where every man will be. Roan was halfway to the picket line when one of the guards nearly found him. Or found the space where he'd just been, which isn't quite the same thing. The man swept his lantern in a slow arc and caught nothing but shadow and stone. He stood there a moment with the lamp raised, listening. The camp was quiet. He returned to the fire. What he didn't notice was that 3 of the 6 horses on the picket line now had their lead ropes tied in slip knots instead of the square knots they'd started with. Easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. Roan moved like a man who'd learned early in life that a snapped twig can be the last sound a person makes. It was near the dead hour, 2 in the eye, morning by Roan's reckoning, when Dell recognized him. Dell had been sitting up, as he often did, feeding small sticks to the coals, keeping them alive without building the fire higher. That told you something about how Dell's mind worked. He looked up when Roan stepped into the firelight, which Roan allowed because it was time. Dell went still. His eyes moved across Roan's face, dropped to his hands, came back up. "I know you," he said quietly. "Maybe," Roan said. "They said you were dead." Dell's voice didn't rise. "It got careful, out past the Cimarron. 4 years ago, 3, Roan said, and I wasn't dead." I was done. Dell didn't reach for his gun. Sat right where he was, hands where they were, and thought through his situation. That was Dell's way. The fire was the only light. Cutter was asleep. The other men were asleep. And sitting across those coals from Dell was the man that riders out of Cimarron country had called the ghost, not as any kind of tribute, but as the most honest explanation available for how men died in those parts. Without anyone witnessing the shooting, even the horses on the picket. Line had gone still. "What do you want?" Dell said. "The woman leaves. Unharmed. Tonight." A pause. "And I need your horse. Mine's a mile out." "I'll leave yours there." Dell looked into the fire. "Cyrus won't stand for it. I didn't ask Cyrus." A long silence. "What happens to us? Depends entirely on what you all do in the next hour," Roan said. He'd already been to Della, maybe 15 minutes before this. Crouched in the shadow of the south wall beside her bedroll, one finger raised to his lips. His voice quieter than cloth on cloth, he told her what was coming. Pressed a short-bladed knife into her hand, showed her the grip. Said there would be noise, possibly fire, and when the horses moved, she needed to move for the canyon mouth. He described the slip knots, said to pull them if she reached the picket line first. She studied him for a moment in the dark. "You're the man from the coach, yes." She seemed to consider asking something further. "Let it go." She took the knife and looked at it with the quiet, focused attention of a woman, deciding something about herself she'd been circling for a long time. The camp unraveled faster than he'd planned. They usually do. Dell held to his word and stayed put. But Cutter woke up, and Cutter never woke at the right moment. His first instinct was a shout, which pulled 2 more men out of their blankets. Roan had already cut the main line on the picket gate. He touched the repositioned lantern to the edge of the deadfall. 900 pounds of seasoned horse, when it decides it does not want to be where it is, does not hold a discussion about the matter. The 3 horses on the slip knots went first, moving fast. They collided with the others coming the opposite direction. Then there were 6 horses going 6 different directions in a dark canyon, and every man on the ground was scrambling not to be crushed beneath them. Roan moved through the chaos as though he were somewhere else entirely. He came around the south wall. Della was already on her feet, already moving toward him. He had 3 strides on the men behind him and intended to keep them. What he hadn't accounted for was Cyrus Vane, who had not been sleeping. Vane had been awake on the canyon's eastern rim. He came down the slope fast, got himself between Della and the canyon mouth, pistol leveled. The smile was gone. "Stop," Vane said, still controlled, but with the thing underneath it showing through now. "Both of you," Roan stopped. Edge of the firelight. Hands out, open, level in front of him. Vane looked him over. "Who are you?" "Just a passenger, the hell you are." He stepped closer. "Put down whatever you're carrying. Mr. Vane," Roan said. "I'm going to ask you once to let her go." Vane laughed, short and hard. "You're going to ask me?" "Once," Roan said. "That's all this is." Vane raised the gun toward Roan's face, the way men who've never been properly asked tend to do, and Della Mercer, who had spent 24 years being careful and frightened, and patient and right, stepped to Vane's left side and fired. She wasn't trained. The knife was still in her other hand. The small derringer from her bag was shaking, and she hit Cyrus Vane in the shoulder at roughly 4 feet, which is the distance at which most things that genuinely need doing actually get done. It was enough. Vane dropped to one knee with a shout. The pistol hit the ground. Roan kicked it away in the same motion he was already making, and then they were running through the canyon mouth, past the cut ropes, through the narrow dark passage, and out into cold, open desert air that expanded around them like a room with all the walls removed. Behind them in the canyon, shouting and the last panicked churning of hooves. Nothing organized itself fast enough to follow. The terrain wouldn't allow it. They walked 4 miles in the dark before they reached Roan's horse, a gray and brown gelding that was considerably calmer than circumstances warranted. He helped Della into the saddle and walked, leading the horse by its reins. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Come morning, riders from the Tularosa County Deputy's office reached the Box Canyon and found Vane's camp in considerable disarray. Vane was there, wounded and furious but alive. Dell and Cutter and 4 others alongside him. 2 men had walked out during the night and were picked up on the flats. The evidence in camp, stacked against testimony already on file from the driver and 3 other passengers, was more than sufficient. And there in Vane's saddlebag was a folded letter in a familiar hand, detailing the coach schedule and passenger list, signed at the bottom by Elias Scobell. Scobell was arrested at the way station before noon. He protested. Nobody listened. The Jornada Basin, which had functioned as Vane's private road for 6 years, went quiet by midsummer in a way that ranchers and freight managers hadn't experienced in recent memory. But that chapter belongs to other men and other days. What I want to tell you about is the morning Roan brought Della into Tularosa. He wouldn't enter the town. Stopped on the low hill north of the main street and pointed out the schoolhouse where Thomas Hadley worked, easy enough to identify, being the only building with chalk dust on the windowsills. Said her man was probably inside and that she ought to go down. She sat the horse for a moment and looked at the town below her. 2 days of hard trail still written on her. She looked, Roan thought, like a woman who had learned something about herself on this road that she hadn't known when she started it. Come in, she said. Just for a meal. Thomas would want to thank you. I appreciate that, Roan said. But I've got road. She turned those clear eyes on him, the ones that had been reading him carefully since the coach. You told Dell 3 years ago you were done, that's right, but you weren't. He considered it. Not quite, he said. She held the knife out, handle toward him. He shook his head. She looked at it for a moment, then put it in her pocket, which seemed right. Then she rode down the hill toward the chalk-dusted schoolhouse and the man and the life she'd traveled 130 miles to find. Roan watched until she reached the door. The schoolteacher came out. A long moment in the morning light, and Thomas Hadley took both her hands in his. Roan turned the gray and brown gelding north and didn't look back. I've heard it told, friend, that Della Hadley, she took his name that same week, named the first classroom she ever ran as a schoolteacher for a man called Roan. Just the name on the board. No explanation offered. Anyone who asked was told it was for someone who'd helped her on the road south. She never gave more than that, and no one pushed for it. Some debts can't be repaid to the person who made them. So you carry the name somewhere, it can still do something useful. Here's what stays with me. Roan didn't enter that canyon making noise. He went in quiet, hands open, and he used the ground itself against the men who believed they owned it. That's not the patience of someone who's surrendered. That's the patience of someone who knows exactly where they're going and is willing to let the situation do the work for them. And there's something else. There are people you'll encounter, if you're fortunate, who see you in trouble and don't make it about themselves. They don't need you watching when they act. They press a knife into your hand, give you a plan, remind you of the courage you were already carrying without knowing it. And then they ride on before you can thank them properly. You never quite close that account. The best you can do is notice the next time someone else needs it, and do something about it. People like that are rarer than water on the Jornada del Muerto. But they exist. And on a long night on a hard road, that's not a small thing. That's the story of Roan and Della Mercer. And the night a box canyon stopped serving the men who built it. If this one rode along with you tonight, drop a like before you head out. Subscribe if you haven't. More stories are on their way, and I'd hate for you to miss one. And one last thing. These are original works of fiction, written with the help of artificial intelligence and a genuine love for the American West. The people and events are invented. Any resemblance to real men or women, living or long gone, is coincidence. The Jornada del Muerto is real. Roan was never on it, or if he was, nobody who saw him came back to say so. Good night, partner. Ride safe.